First, a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm not a ruminant nutritionist and I don't play one on TV. Hey folks, today's video is going to be a question that I had from a viewer via private message, and that was, what are my thoughts on the crude protein requirement for late gestation, early lactation nannies, with a sub-question of why do I see values between 12 and 18% in different places. First, let's talk about the two macronutrients. One is crude protein, the other one is energy, often expressed as TDN, total digestible nutrients. Both can be expressed as a percentage of the feed stuff, meaning if you feed 10 pounds of something and its as-fed crude protein percentage is 50%, you fed 5 pounds of crude protein. Same thing goes for TDN. Keep in mind that those percentages, there's two different ways to do it. There is as-fed, which includes the moisture content of whatever that is. If it's hay, it's probably going to be around 10%. But you know, some things like protein tubs, it could be significantly higher than that. And so when you're looking at that feed value, you want to keep that in mind when you're comparing different feedstuffs, especially. The other way to measure it is dry matter, and this is a way of reducing, you know, whether it's a protein tub that's 30% moisture or hay that's 10% moisture, you remove all that moisture and then you just measure the crude protein percent of the dry matter. So energy is used for energy, to walk around, to breathe, to shiver when it's cold. So energy requirements can be pretty flexible with not just the animal's genetics and breeding and all that, but also the environment. You know, if you've got animals out on corn stalks and they're having to walk around to find their feed a lot, they're going to be burning a lot more energy to do that. If it's colder out, they're going to be burning more energy to stand there and shiver to try to stay warm. Or protein, on the other hand, is used, yes, they need a certain amount of protein just to sustain themselves, just to keep alive. You know, cells die and need to be replaced. But protein is used primarily for growing themselves or growing a fetus. Or growing a live kid that's on the ground through protein that's in their milk production. So when an animal is growing, either itself or its offspring, it's going to have much higher protein requirements than when it's just what you call in maintenance, meaning it's not doing anything. It's not growing any kids, it's not growing any fetuses, it's just there and existing. Sub-question of why do I see values between 12 and 18% in different places? And 12's pretty low and 18's pretty high, but I could believe that you'd find sources that would say both of those. I would say closer like 13 to 16% would typically be the range. But the kind of primary driving thing there, yes, there are animals that are more feed efficient and less feed efficient, absolutely. But a bigger thing is, what are they doing? Are they still a young doeling, you know, a young yearling, or even a first-year doeling that's pregnant with twins or triplets? That young doeling is still growing themselves. They need protein just to keep themselves growing, and then they also need protein to grow their fetuses and to grow their kids through their milk once they're on the ground. Versus a mature nanny, you know, fully grown nanny that's, you know, 5 or 6 years old that maybe is only growing a single, is not going to have as high protein requirements. So that's why you see that range, the primary reason that you see that range. I will mention that conventional wisdom is that at about 17% crude protein for ruminants, you kind of start to hit a point of diminishing returns where the energy requirements to digest that protein get so high that it's no longer worth it. So that's why you typically don't see producers, you know, pumping like 22% crude protein into grower kids trying to get them to gain a pound per day. You can't really do that. You hit the limits of biology at a certain point. One note that I will throw in for cattle producers, you know, a 1,300-pound cow might wean a 650-pound calf once a year. That's her gross product, 650 pounds worth of calf. So she's producing about 50% of her body weight once a year. A sheep or goat, on a commercial setting, it is totally reasonable to expect that sheep or goat to produce its own body weight, meaning a 100-pound doe will produce 2 50-pound kids, for example, once a year. So that's where you do see much higher productivity from sheep or goats, but also higher nutritional requirements. All right, so if you are feeding a bunch of late gestation or early lactation nannies and they all have different nutritional requirements, how can you manage that? my theory, and I'll just, to spoiler alert here, my theory is to let the animals manage it themselves. But there are other approaches. I'll talk about those. One thing that you'll see is people will go and have every pregnant nanny or ewe ultrasounded, and they will separate off the singles and the twins and the triplets, the ewes or does that are having those, into separate groups and feed them differently. You can do that. There's economical reasons to do it. There's also practical, nutritional reasons to do it, to not spend too much money or overfeed those animals that have lower requirements. There are input costs to that. I don't do it. I don't see myself probably ever doing it, but I reserve the right to change my mind at any time in the future. So how do I manage it? Well, we'll start with that I always want to make sure that they have some kind of filler. If they're on corn stalks, that's the corn stalks. If they're on winter pasture, that's the dormant grasses. If they're here in the dry lots, I'll try to provide some kind of low quality grass hay or something like that, something that's economical, very cheap, in other words. This is actually oat hay. Up here in the dry lots, I do also look to have something that's suitable for use as bedding, so it's kind of a dual purpose type of thing. You'll notice there's alfalfa over here in these feeders. There's open space in front of the feeders, and we have goats coming over here and voluntarily chewing through this pretty rough looking oat hay. It's mostly full of weeds. And that's that kind of alludes to my point here, in that I will provide alfalfa hay on what I call an empty bucket ration. I say I call it, somebody else came up with that term. And that means that I give them just as much as they're gonna eat, or in this case, when they're here in dry lots, we put hay in these feeders, we fill up the top, and they eat everything, and then they get more. So they have to clean up the bottom there too, not just the tops. And what that means is if they manage their own nutrition, if they need more protein, they'll come over here and eat alfalfa. If they have sufficient protein, they'll come over here and just eat some of the lower quality, lower cost hay. Why does this matter beyond economics? If you are feeding excess protein, it does cost more energy to digest that. If you are feeding excess protein, a thing that you can look for if you think you might be is excess hoof growth, the hoofs foundering. I've done this incidentally through just mistakes I've made in the past. About 4 or 5 years ago, we had a rough winter. We had ice pack and snowpack on the ground for about 3 months straight. And even when they were on corn stalks, I was still, most of their feed was just the alfalfa that I was giving them. And most of the time that was too much protein for most of those goats. And as a result, that winter, I saw pretty bad hoof growth. That's the last time I've done hoof trimming. And that was because it was my fault. It was a management mistake on my part. And ever since then, I've been much more cognizant to make sure that they have some filler that's available. And since I've been doing that, I don't see that excess hoof growth. Now, there are obviously other reasons that you can see excess hoof growth. Even if you do this system and you still see excess hoof growth, okay, it could just be, genetically that animal just has bad feet. Another possibility is that genetically that animal is not very good at managing its own nutrition and just gorges itself on excess protein all the time that it doesn't really need, instead of coming over here and eating some filler. So either way, good reason to cull the animal. But like I've alluded to before, if it's just 1 or 2 animals having a problem, it's probably the animal's problem. If it's a whole bunch of animals having problems, might be a management problem.